about user acquisition. That's actually quite interesting topic. A lot of that stuff is actually happening there. So on one side, if you look at the business, not always the the smoothest in the industry. On the other hand, there's actually quite interesting to see what's happening in the data. So I look at the different type of the data, especially on data AI, and check what we can see in that specific perspective. So in that presentation, actually I looked at following topics. Okay, what is really happening in user acquisition and paid? If we look at the data, what are, like, at least my opinion, like some development areas for user acquisition people, and what is the additional context for UA topics. So the first one, if we look at the first topic, which is like how actually what we see at the data in user acquisition and in paid traffic in general, actually quite a lot. So the first one, if we look at the data, and if we start from gaming, because I have the data for gaming and for apps, that's the data comparing like the paid installs, so the installs paid via paid traffic year over year, looking at the January till May 2023 versus January to May 2022. We see that actually that number of installs grew quite significantly on Android. Of course, that data is based on the top games. So based on top 1,000 games by revenue in the data AI, we see much stronger growth on top games, but actually all across the board we see at least 30% year over year. What is happening? Most, of course, those installs were coming not necessarily from US, because US, in this case, was a little bit below the average. That's around Android. What is actually getting even more interesting is actually iOS, because in iOS, if we look at the top 10 games on iOS worldwide, the number of paid installs grew 200% year over year, which means that everyone was scared of this user acquisition on iOS, but still seems that industry found a way to go into that perspective. And of course, because of those privacy challenges, because of some data issues, kind of the scale of businesses will actually has quite significant influence on the outcome. Yes, so the bigger the business, the more data it has, so it's actually easier really to cope with that stuff. So that's why if we actually look at the like other segments of games in iOS, they grew much less than actually top games. What about apps? In apps, actually, that situation it's a little bit more diverse. So in this case, on one side, we see that the paid acquisition in apps is growing as well. In terms of Android, again, we have top 10 apps by revenue, top 10, top 11, 50, and so on. We see that actually this perspective of paid search is a little bit smaller on apps, but still growing significantly, especially in those apps that have some subscriptions and some more like the more let's kind of direct source of revenue. If we look at the iOS, actually that growth is way more significant. Yeah. So we see that actually on app side, iOS side is much stronger in terms of the paid. In this way that like the monetization, I mean, growth is following the monetization. So that's why I would say usually that apps are having stronger monetization on the iOS side. So we see actually in that terms of outcome. And again, it's just based on the top games and top apps that have the highest monetization. So that's probably like the average market would be much below those ratio, but still showing some trends. And of course, we can ask ourselves, okay, what is happening in organic? That organic is kind of much lower in terms of the year-over-year growth. So in most of the segments, the share of organic is actually declining, which of course, if paid is growing, then the organic cannot actually follow exactly the same path, especially that the number of installs on the market are not growing so heavily. We see that actually very similar trend in terms of games on Android, on iOS. If we look at apps, it's actually getting even more interesting when we get to the point when actually we look, okay, what is really happening in terms of the share of the paid in the different types of businesses. So this is actually share of the apps and games, where at least 40% of how actually grew the share of apps that at least have at least 40% of traffic coming from paid. We see that actually it grew quite significantly on Android, but still, actually, what is interesting, that share of organic is higher on Android than iOS. But across the board, actually, that growth of companies that actually investing in paid actually is growing. And of course, we can look at that, okay, what is really happening between, what are the differences between different categories. So if we start from gaming, those categories have the highest growth. So we see the highest growth in terms of the paid traffic, in adventure, in some simulation, educational games, word games. We see much smaller growth in terms of card games, for example, sport games, racing games, usually those games that have a little bit more challenging monetization, and then they have much higher saturation as well. This is the data actually for Android, but in this case, we'll look at the top games by downloads. If we look at apps, that situation is, of course, way more diverse, because in case of apps, there is much more connection between specific use case and the COVID versus what is the purpose of the specific app. Yeah. So, for example, if we had some apps related to events, or topics related to fitness, topics related even to for example, social or communication. Those use cases that, of course, were extremely strong during the COVID. In those categories, that growth is much lower. But of course, there are some types of apps that have extremely strong growth, personalization, productivity tools, like travel. Because of course now, as the offline world is open, then the use cases beyond those apps are much more valid, which means that actually the paid is really following that use case as well. If we go deeper and we look what is happening in iOS, we see actually quite similar case, with probably a higher share of categories that are growing, usually again coming mostly from this higher monetization, especially, for example, again, productivity, like sports, utilities, travel. Those categories have the highest much higher growth than average. And that's actually, if we look at, okay, what categories are growing faster, which categories are growing not so fast in this paid. Of course, we can ask ourselves, okay, if I work with UA, I'm UA manager, what are these development areas? And of course, there is the word of AI that's really on the lips of everyone. The AI will replace everyone, especially in user acquisition. And actually, what is interesting, if we look at that the data, for example, for a different gaming and apps categories, this is the quite recent data around what are the bidding strategies used by the different categories at Google. Yeah, and we see that actually, if we look at those categories that are really related, especially to value. So in this case, we have these TROAS, so like TROAS campaigns that are based on the value. And if we look at those AC actions, so those when we define, okay, our action that really matters for us is, for example, like purchase or like specific action, and I'm bidding for those actions. If we look at the deeper, it's actually majority of that spent already. Yeah. So in this case, if we are saying about the AI, that the AI is actually like present in user acquisition job for quite long time already. Yeah? So it's like every major user acquisition platform is relying more and more on AI, which means that more and more actually often uh, less and less job of the user acquisition people is just to, for example, change the bits or like change the specific like cost per install for the specific apps or games. Yeah, you just define your action, you define your cost of acquisition, and the AI is actually uh, uh, like doing the job for you. Yeah, so that's why I would say again, initially user acquisition people were more related to changing the bits, changing the stuff. But now I think more and more actually work of the for the future of the more and more work of the user acquisition people is actually relying to those areas, like looking at the input data, looking at the product, looking at the creative and store listing. What I mean by that is that on one side, if we look at the broader perspective of user acquisition and the importance of data, for example, I think if we look at the input data, which in general in platforms, when at the end of the day you defining the specific data input, and then machine learning actually is working on your behalf based on the data. I think more and more actually of the work of the future, or like current and future work of user acquisition people will be starting from how good we are actually working, how well is actually our cooperation with our analytical and analytics people defining how actually we measure the data, how actually making sure that we understand how the data is measured and what is the conversion window that we are using. What should be actually the trade-off between precision and risk? Because, for example, if we have the data conversion window 7 days, we actually minimizing the risk, because we are, of course, pushing for the users who are monetizing heavily. But on the other side, we can actually really not use the opportunity to use actually attract the users who are paying later, but they're paying a lot. Yeah, they're like a lot of people who just come later. They actually can pay a lot. Yeah, so and then of course we have those challenges related to the data privacy. Yeah, because more and more stuff requires like kind of stronger cooperation between like data people and user acquisition people. And those discussion around how to actually make the data actionable and actually how actually cooperate between user acquisition data, I think is getting, I would say, getting more and more diverse. Like starting from the project like this one that was done, for example, on the King side, when on one side they try to understand not only performance but incrementality of the specific traffic channel, yeah, or they wanted to really not only have good understanding of the scan conversions in case of iOS, but trying to understand how actually the Google data modeling, that is the closest way to actually look at the data in terms of bidding versus the performance, how actually that correlates with our data in the way that we can really understand how actually specific changes in the campaign are influencing our data. And then in this case, even if the project was, of course, like at the end of the day, including some casual impact analysis, when they were kind of trying to understand, okay, what is that specific outcome of that specific activities. But of course, like user acquisition team was actually driving that conversation, because in this case they knew really how that algorithm works on the Google side, they were able to really actually influence the discussion with the data people. Or like another example, when we have this interesting case from the word remit case, when they were, for example, in iOS, they were relying on the ATT data, and they wanted just to focus on those people who agreed to share the data on iOS. But in this case, one of the biggest projects they were driving was really the way, how to really increase the share of the people who are actually agreeing to share the data. So in this case, I think in the current job of the UA people, again, less and less job is something that we could say as, okay, that's the typical UA job, but more and more is actually exactly, for example, influence the data part, because again, in the data, shit in, shit out. Yeah. So if you do not define well the data input, then the outcome coming from machine learning from the performance of the campaign would not be the best as well. And then we have another part which is related, for example, to understanding the creative assets. Again, another point when making sure that, okay, as the person who works on the user acquisition side, I work very well with the creative people to make sure that okay, our creatives are really optimal and adjusted for the specific platform, because again, creatives for TikTok are totally different than creatives for Google, not just by the size of those creatives, but what is the typical length, what is the typical dynamics in the creative and so on. Yeah, how actually making sure that we actually can have this balance between increasing the IPM install per mile, but on the other side, that we are actually attracting the right installs as well. Because at the end of the day, if we're increasing the IPM, if we're increasing CTR, then of course the platform is selling those installs to us cheaper as well. And then, of course, there is really kind of the alignment between these creatives, product side, and store listing for the final outcome. So in this case, even this creative part from user acquisition side could be, for example, looking like, okay, I know what kind of creative sizes, what kind of creative formats are used, for example, at Google. And that, of course, if I share it with my team, especially with creative team, it helps to increase the performance. But I can go much deeper because, for example, if I look at my experience at the data, and I look at, for example, what are like the video length by the different categories, we see, for example, there are some categories like, let's see, like, for example, role playing, strategy, for example, like casino, stocks and investments, when a lot of stuff is coming from very long creatives, versus we have some categories where actually really short creatives matter. And again, why? Actually, quite kind of simple reason. Yeah, if we have some product that requires very high engagement, requires very good understanding of the specific product, like crypto, like casino. When you have, again, there is really big differences between those products. The creatives need to be much longer, much more explaining the situation of the specific product, versus if I have, for example, specific businesses where end of the day it's about very broad and cheap acquisition, because the business works on pretty low margins, like for example in shopping, then of course usually very short messages are easier to really push the, for example, cost of install cheaper. Yeah. So and then we can go further, like looking at the data, for example, okay, even if I compare what is share of the different formats in terms of versus like on Google side. If I have, for example, okay, we see that share of landscape creative is much higher, for example, on iOS than Android. I can ask yourself, okay, why it's happening that? The reason is actually, again, quite simple. On iOS, majority of the inventory on Google site is actually coming from YouTube, which means that majority of creatives, they will look like this one, yeah? Which means that that's finally how that creative will look like to the user. And actually, why I'm saying that? Because again, that experience that I have as the user acquisition person, as the person who works very deeply in the specific platform, I can really share that experience and that knowledge with, for example, creative people that prepare the creatives, making sure that exactly, again, that creative is really adjusted to the platform, that creative is really improving the CTR and it's really improving that IPM. So again, on that side, I think more and more job of user acquisition people is not exactly just to manage the campaign, but streamline that communication between that specific campaign and the other teams that are really useful and needed for that campaign and specific product optimization. And of course, we can go even going much deeper, and you can ask and say, okay, what is really happening around optimization of the product, optimization of the store listing in the same way. And then the last point, which I think is really important here, is actually that additional layer that comes to that point, is that, okay, we have this product, creative, UA, and data part, but then there is additional layer related to, okay, there is some context layer, which is, I think, really needed and important to know if I want to be good UA person. And for example, one of the most important one of the most important parts of this context layer is, for example, understanding what is really happening on the market. For example, if I look at the year-over-year growth, in this case, we compare last 12 months versus what happened 3 years ago, we see that, okay, by worldwide, in this case, by average during those 3 years, the downloads grew by 40%. But there were markets like Philippines, Pakistan, Indonesia, or like Peru that grew way, way more significantly. And actually the same on the iOS side, which means that less and less, smaller and smaller part of that UA effectiveness, for example, will be coming from US. Less and less of that performance will be coming from just tier 1 markets, which means that if I have more and more knowledge around what is the difference between audiences in Vietnam versus audiences, for example, in UK and US, then it creates way, way better outcome for the campaigns. For example, a very interesting story that in Vietnam, a lot of people, in general, the internet started from the people who were playing games in internet cafes, which means that in that country, gaming matters player to player. And that's why if you look actually at the majority of the creatives coming from Vietnam, most of them are actually showing not just one player playing in the game, but many players even sometimes sitting to each other playing the same game. So I think those insights about specific markets, the more you have them, the better to optimize those sometimes exotic markets. And then the next this next layer is really all that layer related to risk management. What I mean by that is, again, more and more user acquisition job, especially in the period where the cost of money is much higher than used to be. It's actually related to understanding how, for example, my campaigns correlate with my cash flow. Does it make sense to extend the payback period, like, for example, from 3 months to 9 months? What kind of influence it will have on the bottom line? How much money actually it makes sense to spend on good creative? Does it make sense to spend money on creatives? Maybe it makes sense to do it internally. Maybe it makes sense to do it externally. And of course, with that, I think it comes that question: okay, to which extent this magic AI will actually replace digital marketers, like user acquisition people? I don't think it will be the case, because what will happen just in the what will happen just in that in this user acquisition is just those new nice tools that are using AI that are coming to the market will be just additional multipliers. They will just be better tools to really actually make the work of the people who are really good in user acquisition, to make that work more stand out and actually working better. Yes, so it's like, I think it used to be many times that when something new was coming, like this industrial revolution, like in 19th century or whatever, there was discussion that those machines will actually replace people. But then what actually happened was really, again, those technologies were helping just to maximize the effect of really good people. And then I think what will be happening in the user acquisition job. And I think what is happening is that depending on what kind of approach people will have, because again, if we define that user acquisition job is just mostly about changing the bits, about changing the price of creatives, which is okay, just tell me what to do. Like, like, okay, if ROAS below 10%, then decrease the bid by 15%. If ROAS higher than 12%, then increase the bid by 10%. Yeah, if it's like, if we define most of the user acquisition job by that perspective, which is more like this kind of part, then I think such people will have the challenge, because again, AI will be just better in that. Yeah, because AI is just much better. But if we define the role of user acquisition as the role, okay, let's optimize, let's maximize the effect of the specific activities. And again, that activities include optimization of the data input and optimization of creative, optimization of the how actually optimize the whole purchase funnel across creative, listing, product. Then again, AI will be just adding additional multipliers for those people. That, at least from my view. And again, just to summarize, I think UA is still in pretty good shape. So I think the UA people still are really needed. And I mean, the more competitive market, of course, the harder market it gets, but still UA has quite important part there. UA is becoming broader as well, which means we see more and more companies that are at least trying to understand how this user acquisition works and start to use it even in small scale. Kind of right now, it gets to the point that user acquisition is kind of like almost one of the base parts of the mobile gaming and apps like industry. And again, UA, in my perspective, is not about changing the bits. And AI will be just additional layer as long as we know what we are doing. And that would be all from my side.